The American Enterprise Institute presents the Distinguished Lecture Series on the Bicentennial of the United States. Our host for this thought-provoking series is Vermont Royster, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the Wall Street Journal and professor of journalism and public affairs at the University of North Carolina.
I'm Vermont Royster with another in the American Enterprise Institute series of distinguished lectures on the American Bicentennial. In honor of the 200th birthday of the United States, the AEI has invited some of the nation's leading scholars to discuss their views on the American Revolution and how it still affects all of us 2 centuries later. The AEI is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research institution based in Washington, D.C. Its goal is to promote the public discussion of the major issues of our times. The Distinguished Lecture Series is a basic part of that program. Today's lecture will be delivered by Edward C. Banfield, Professor of Public Policy Analysis and Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Banfield delivers his lecture from the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. The Institute is designed to be a permanent memorial to Benjamin Franklin, one of Philadelphia's favorite sons. In its 150-year history, the Franklin Institute has grown from a room with a display case to a huge institution, displaying many of the latest advances in science and industry. The Institute had to be large and diverse to honor a man as complex and accomplished as Benjamin Franklin. Franklin has been described as the man who snatched the lightning from heaven and the scepter from tyrants. In the Philadelphia of the late 1700s, Benjamin Franklin was a towering figure. He was a scientist, a statesman, a journalist, and a philosopher, and he was successful at each. Paintings and exhibits at the Franklin Institute today honor many of the man's achievements. In his later years, Franklin had trouble reading. His solution to the problem is still in use today. He invented bifocals. Franklin combined his talents for journalism and philosophy into the famed Poor Richard's Almanac. Through the Almanac and some of his other writings, Franklin taught the world that early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, that God helps them that help themselves, that people can be snug as a bug in a rug, and a word to the wise is enough, and that there never was a good war or a bad peace. At Independence Hall, when he was signing the Declaration of Independence, Franklin cut short arguments between some of the Founding Fathers when he pointed out, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." Franklin's early experiments with electricity made some major contributions to the development of today's push-button society, and displays on the nature of energy rank among the major exhibits at the Franklin Institute. Children, and grown-ups too, are encouraged to experiment for themselves on machines that demonstrate the workings of energy and gravity. Another purpose of the Institute is to present papers and lectures by distinguished scholars in the arts and sciences. In the field of urban research and commentary, perhaps no one is more distinguished than today's AEI lecturer, Dr. Edward C. Banfield. Dr. Banfield is introduced by the eminent historian and political scientist, Dr. Rexford Guy Tugwell.
I'm delighted to be able to present to this distinguished audience an old colleague of mine, a colleague that goes way back to New Deal days, for one thing, but for another, we were together at the University of Chicago. While he was at the University of Chicago, he wrote a book which was recently described by one of our other colleagues there as a classic. It's the moral basis of a civilization that is backward, the moral basis of a backward civilization. And it's a beautiful book. If you've never read it, I recommend it to you. I have difficulty in understanding that his more recent book, which was called The Unheavenly City, has caused some controversy. Because when I read the book, I was delighted with it. I thought it was the first really sensible thing that had been said about cities for a long time. Some people don't seem to agree. However, I don't know what he's going to say to you this afternoon, but I'm quite sure that it will be important, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce him to you. Professor Edward Banfield of the University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Dr. Tugwell. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a particular pleasure to me to be introduced to this audience by Professor Tugwell. It was Professor Tugwell who enabled me to become a part of academic life, and he has been, for many years, my much admired and respected friend. It would be very pleasant on such an occasion as this to find that the American city has been and is a unique and unqualified success, and to be able to show that its successes all derive from adherence to principles established and given institutional form in the Revolution, the approaching bicentennial of which we are here to commemorate. Unfortunately, it is all too evident that even if this were the 4th of July, I would not have license for that sort of oratory. In many important respects, the American city is a great success, but there are certainly many things about it that are thoroughly unpleasant, and some that are or ought to be intolerable. Moreover, it is obvious that in most important respects, the good and the bad alike, the American city differs more in degree than in kind from cities elsewhere. What we have to be proud of and what we have to worry about are, for the most part, features of modernity, not of anything specific to our country. Americans, Thomas Lowe Nichols wrote in 1864, are sanguine and hope to succeed in the wildest speculations. But if they do not, they have little scruple about repudiation. A man cares little for being ruined, and as little about ruining others. But then, ruin in the United States is not like ruin in older countries, where a man can fail a dozen times and still go ahead and get credit again. Ruin does not amount to much. In search of the dollar, the American has been constantly on the move. Stephen Thernstrom, the historian, has estimated that over the past 170 years, probably only 40 to 60% of the adult males in most cities at any point in time were in the same city 10 years later. a migratory race, Tocqueville called us, which, he said, having reached the Pacific Ocean, will retrace its steps and destroy the social communities which it will have formed and left behind. The ethnic diversity of our cities has been unparalleled. As early as 1890, 1/3 of the residents of cities of over 100,000 were foreign-born. 10 million foreign-born were counted in the 1970 census, and their median family income, it's interesting to note, was not appreciably lower than that of all U.S. families. The American city has always provided a high level of living for the great majority of its residents. It was because of what he saw in Europe that Thomas Jefferson came to loathe the city. The American city has always had more and better schooling, housing. In 1900, 1/4 of the families in most large cities owned their own homes. Sanitation, transportation, more of all of these and other things than city dwellers elsewhere. Let me turn to civility. Organized philanthropy has always been conspicuous in the American city. Museums, libraries, symphony orchestras, asylums, hospitals, colleges, parks and playgrounds. The number and variety of such undertakings, begun and supported in whole or part by service clubs, foundations, and other private efforts, is impressive and, I believe, peculiarly American. Most of these achievements are largely to the credit of the go-getter, but he must also be mentioned as a doer of evil, as one who, to get things done, has been willing to go to any lengths. Politicians took bribes, Lincoln Steffens told us, because businessmen paid bribes. And so it was they, the businessmen, who were the real corrupters of politics. The extent of corruption in American cities has long been the wonder of the civilized world. Some have tried to account for it by pointing to the masses of poor and politically inexperienced immigrants, but this is surely only a partial explanation. Boss Tweed and his 40 thieves, there were at that time 40 members of the New York City Council. Boss Tweed and his 40 thieves were in business before the immigrants, most of them, arrived. Frank J. Goodnow, the author of the first, or I think one of the first textbooks on city government, written about the turn of the century, stated the puzzling facts. Philadelphia, with a large native-born and home-owning and a small tenement house population, with a charter which is largely based on what is considered to be advanced ideas on the subject of municipal government, is said to be both corrupt and contented. Steffens' phrase, you recall. The experience of cities like Philadelphia, Goodnow concluded, encourages the belief that there must be something in the moral character of the populations. If corruption was common in American cities, so was violent crime. As far back as records go, and that's as much as 100 years in only 2 cities, I think. The homicide rate has been extraordinarily high by the standards of other countries.
We're listening to Dr. Edward C. Banfield trace the development of large urban areas in the United States. In just one moment, he will continue his lecture from the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. Unlike many museums, the displays at the Franklin Institute are meant to be touched and worked and truly experienced. Young people don't just look at an airplane, they climb aboard, sit in the cockpit, and do just about anything they want except fly it. Even the human heart, called here the engine of life, becomes a learning experience at the Franklin Institute. In the auditorium at the Institute, another kind of learning experience is in progress, as Dr. Edward C. Banfield continues his lecture on the American city.
Class differences have, of course, existed in all countries, but in America, where there's probably been more upward mobility than anywhere else, to be socially defined as no account has been crushing in a way that it could not be, where everyone knew that rising in the world was out of the question. Perhaps because most have expected to rise, if not themselves, then through their children. The American city, unlike cities in other countries, has never produced a radical working class movement. Perhaps because some have been demoralized by their failure to rise in a society in which one is supposed to rise. The American city has had a lumpen proletariat, a lower as distinguished from a working class, one more conspicuous and possibly more resistant to absorption than that of most other countries. If the openness of American society has produced total alienation in some, it has probably created disaffection in many more. In a society preoccupied with getting and spending, those who have not managed to get as much as others with whom they compare themselves are likely to feel poor and perhaps to blame themselves as well as the society for being relatively badly off, even if they are in absolute terms reasonably well off. Turning now to government, what is perhaps most conspicuous to the foreigner is the localism of our politics. Localism in 2 senses. First, that every city, even every village, has, by the standards of other countries, an extraordinary degree of independence in dealing with a wide range of matters, including usually police and schools. Where else could the voters of a small town decide not to permit the construction of a $600 million oil refinery? Localism also in the sense that city politics turns on local, often neighborhood concerns and not upon national issues or ideologies. Our cities have been and still are run, to the extent that one can say they are run at all, by politicians, meaning persons whose talent is for managing conflict, not by career civil servants or planners persons whose talent is for laying out consistent courses of action aiming toward agreed upon goals. To be sure, thousands of documents called plans have been made under the auspices of American local governments, but I think it would be hard to find one that has been carried into effect, unless by the chances of politics. The problem of metropolitan organization exists in this country in a form that may be unique. Actually, it is two quite different problems. One consists of the multiplicity of more or less overlapping jurisdictions within a single metropolitan area, and the other of the absence within any such area of a general purpose government having jurisdiction over the whole of the area. It is a peculiarly American practice to refer a great many matters to the electorate, not only the choice of mayors and councilors, but also in many places of judges, as well as decisions about capital expenditures, zoning, governmental structure. Finally, it is remarkably easy for a small number of persons, especially if they are organized, to prevent an American local government from carrying out undertakings that are alleged to be, and indeed may be, in the interest of the large majority. Political parties in the United States are not really national organizations. Rather, they are shifting coalitions of those who, by winning elections or otherwise, have assembled enough pieces of authority to count. Because there is power at stake locally, able and ambitious men and women have exerted themselves to get it. They have always been able to afford to offer the voter, enough voters anyway to make a difference, inducements more substantial than ideology, jobs, favors, ethnic recognition. Politics in the American city has been serious business. That is, the politician has been a sort of businessman, just as the businessman has been a sort of politician. Obviously, this would be impossible if power were highly centralized. The fragmentation of authority not only permitted but encouraged its informal centralization by means, notably the machine and the boss, that were corrupt. If, as Stephan said, businessmen gave bribes because they had to, because it was impossible to operate a street railroad without doing so, it was also true that politicians took bribes because they had to. Because to centralize enough power to get things done, they had in one way or another to purchase pieces of authority from voters and others. Without this easy access to power on the local scene, the go-getter would not have had the opportunity to go-get. As it was, he could extend the grids of non-existent cities into the hinterland, confident that he could induce some public body to build a canal, railroad, highway, arsenal, or whatever, that would send land values up. Even the new immigrants' ties, ethnic ties, had a political value that could often be converted into the small amount of capital he needed for a start. These incentives released prodigious amounts of energy, the freedom, near anarchy in places, of the politician, businessman, entrepreneur, was a necessary condition of the great scramble to advance, which Thomas Sloan Nicholson said left all troubled and none satisfied. In Europe, Nichols wrote in a part of that passage that I didn't quote, as a rule, a poor man knows that he must remain poor and he submits to his lot. Most men, he said, live and die in the position to which they are born.
From Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, Dr. Edward C. Banfield is discussing the city and the revolutionary tradition. In just one moment, he will continue. For the thousands of young people who visit the Franklin Institute, there's probably nothing more exciting than watching an old-fashioned locomotive in action. The clanging bells and hooting whistles are fascinating enough, but here the children or the grown-ups can climb into the cab, turn the valves, and before you know it, Casey Jones is alive once more. The building of the railroads in America and the subsequent mobility it provided the American people played a major role in the development of widely scattered urban areas in the United States. And the development of our cities is the subject now being discussed by our AEI lecturer, Dr. Edward C. Banfield.
The explanation that I've offered for the distinctive features of the American city would be more convincing if I could show that in another country, an opposite principle produced opposite results. I believe I can. The history of urban development in Canada provides such a test. For the Canadian political system has always been the opposite of ours in what for me is the crucial respect. I'm not, of course, implying that the Canadians have been any less attached to democracy than we, rather that their conception of it has been essentially different. In Canada, the British tradition was never interrupted. The duty of government has always been to govern, not, as in the United States, to preside over a competition of interests. Canadians, writes Professor Tom Truman of McMaster University, Canadians insist on strong, stable executive government, which once it has made up its mind on what the public interest requires, should take the necessary action quickly and with determination to see it through completely. It goes without saying that the comparison with Canadian experience cannot provide a wholly satisfactory test of my argument, for there are manifestly many differences between the two countries that may account for much of what I'm trying to explain. Although Canada is larger in area than the United States, its great natural resources have been, especially in the 19th century, were much less accessible. It's always had an important French-speaking minority, and it's always been profoundly influenced by events south of the border, here in the United States. The influence of these and other circumstances on urban development has certainly been great, but I believe that the centralized structure of political authority in Canada accounts, better than any other single principle, for the differences between Canadian and American cities with respect to the features that I've listed. Now, a detailed account of Canadian experience is obviously out of the question here, but let me call to your attention a few relevant facts. First, the growth of cities in Canada was slow. As late as 1911, Canada had only 6 cities of 50,000 or more population. of which only 2 had more than 300,000. The go-getter, businessman, booster, speculator has been, at least until very recently, conspicuous by his absence. Horatio Alger heroes, it seems, have never been popular in Canada. It may be indicative, incidentally, of the difference in business ethos that there are about twice as many lawyers per capita in the United States as in Canada. In 1955, the only year for which I have any figure, there was 1 lawyer in private practice per 868 persons here, 1 per 1,630 there. Immigration into Canada was, until well into this century, mainly from the British Isles. British immigrants were long favored by law. By American standards, assimilation of non-British and non-French-speaking immigrants was slow. Not until this century, I believe, was such an immigrant elected to public office. Generally speaking, the level of public services has been low by American standards. Organized philanthropy began late, about World War I, an import from the United States. Large-scale corruption has never been a feature of Canadian city government. There's been very little violent crime. Social mobility has been less. Although radical working-class movements have been able to form governments on the prairies, they have always had more supporters in the urban areas than among the wheat farmers. Urban Canada does not seem to have had a lumpen proletariat on anything like the American scale. The incessant exercise of voting power, Lord Bryce remarked in his essay on Canada, has never possessed any special fascination for the Canadian. Toronto has a metropolitan government, one much admired by American reformers. It was created in 1953 over the objections of most local governments concerned by the provincial government on recommendation of the Ontario Municipal Board, a quasi-judicial body. The possibility of a referendum was never seriously discussed. Can these features of Canadian development be accounted for in large part by the centralized structure of government? I don't have time to develop the evidence in support of this claim, but I must quote one of many pertinent passages from a work by a Canadian sociologist, S.D. Clark. He writes in The Developing Canadian Community, a book published in 1962, a force of Royal Engineers put an end to lawlessness in the mining camps of British Columbia. Settlement of the western prairies and the gold rush of the Klondike took place under the close control of the Northwest Mounted Police. Even in Canadian cities, serious threats to law and order have been met by the decisive use of force. The result, he says, was to establish a tradition of respect for the institution of law and order. The population generally did not feel the need of taking the law into its own hands through mob action or the organization of vigilantes. There was lacking that intense jealousy of local rights, which in the United States made it difficult for federal forces to intervene. The way in which the Northwest Mounted Police came into being was in striking contrast with that of the Texas Rangers. In the United States, the frontier bred a spirit of liberty which often opposed efforts to maintain order. In Canada, he writes, order was maintained at the price of weakening that spirit. One of the great ironies of history, it seems to me, is to be found in these developments, for it was a centralized system like the Canadian, and not a fragmented one like the American, that the principal figures among the founding fathers intended to create. The Revolution, John Adams wrote in a letter in 1818, the Revolution was effected before the war. It was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. So long as the king and all in authority under him were believed to govern according to the laws and constitution derived to them by their ancestors, the colonists thought themselves bound to pray for them as ministers of God ordained for their good. But when they saw those powers renouncing all the principles of authority and bent upon the destruction of their lives, liberties, and properties, they thought it their duty to pray for the Continental Congress and the 13 state Congresses. On this view, the intention of the revolutionaries, if you want to call them that, was to bring about a change of regime, not of political principles. Rulers who had not acted as ministers ordained by God were to be replaced by others who would. There's nothing to contradict this in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson, in writing that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, did not assert anything novel. Since 1689, British monarchs had needed the consent of the House of Commons to raise revenue. And as Martin Diamond pointed out in one of the first of the series of lectures, the Declaration says that consent is required to institute or establish a government, not for the conduct of its affairs. The unchallenged principle was that the conduct of affairs belonged in the hands of those authorized to govern.
We're listening to Dr. Edward C. Banfield of the University of Pennsylvania discussing the city and the revolutionary tradition. In just one moment, his lecture continues. In addition to his other talents, Benjamin Franklin was a noted printer, and the tools he worked with in the 1700s are graphically displayed at the Franklin Institute. But in keeping with the Institute's policy, they are more than just pictures of old printing presses. Here, Franklin's old flatbed press, which once cranked out copies of Poor Richard's Almanac, is still in use. While the press is too valuable to open for public use, skilled printers actually operate the machinery, displaying the same techniques used by Franklin 2 centuries ago. The development of our cities over the past 2 centuries is the subject of today's speaker, Dr. Edward C. Banfield, and he now concludes his remarks.
Adams wanted not only to follow the principles of the British system, but so far as American conditions allowed, to recreate its forms as well. That the executive authority was to be in the hands of one chosen by election did not seem to him or others, most others, to constitute a fundamental change. It had long been understood that in British government, almost all real as opposed to nominal authority, was in the hands of ministers, not of the king. As Gouverneur Morris put it later when addressing the Constitutional Convention, our president will be the British minister. It was in that convention that the distinctively American political arrangements were arrived at. They represented neither the reestablishment of the essential principles of the British system nor the assertion of contrary principles. They were a compromise. That is, the acceptance of contradictory principles. Expediency prevailed, and the result was not a plan, but something that no one quite intended. In the Federalist, Hamilton and Madison acknowledged that the deliberate sense of the community should govern the conduct of those in office, but they added that this did not require an unqualified complaisance to every transient impulse of the people. When occasions present themselves, they wrote, in which the interests of the people are at variance with their inclinations, it is the duty of the persons whom they have appointed to be the guardians of those interests to withstand the temporary delusion. The humors of the legislature did not require unqualified complaisance either. The Federalist paper say, it is certainly desirable that the executive should be in a situation to dare to act his own opinion with vigor and decision. It is one thing to be subordinate to the laws and another to be dependent upon the legislative body. In his farewell address, Washington warned that all combinations and associations, under whatever plausible character, with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities, are of fatal tendency. It's fair to say that until John Quincy Adams left the White House in 1829, there had been no revolution, so far as any of the presidents were concerned. If by revolution one means fundamental change in political principles. One might even say there'd been a counter-revolution, a return to the established principles of the British Constitution, which were, as Dicey later said, supremacy of law and the omnipotence or undisputed supremacy throughout the whole country of the central government. Nevertheless, there were signs before the second Adams left the White House that the government of the United States would never be the monarchical republic that the elder Adams and some of the other founding fathers had intended it to be and imagined that it was. The same forces that prevented the national executive from establishing its mastery led to the development of political parties on a local rather than, as in Canada, a national basis. The parties were coalitions within each state of local interests, which every 4 years formed loose federations to nominate and elect a president. By the 1830s, the American political system had assumed its characteristic and lasting form. The president was indeed an elective monarch, but only with respect to matters in which he was willing to invest the whole force and energy of his office. In the nature of things, there could be few such matters at any one time. With respect to other matters, the system functioned to accommodate competing, more or less parochial interests, not to deliberate about, much less to enforce, a conception of the common good. State and local governments were organized in imitation of the much revered national one, but the imitations did not extend to the feature which the founding fathers had considered crucial: a strong executive, a minister ordained of God for the people's good. Governors and mayors, as I remarked before, were little more than ceremonial figures. In state and local government, the principle of interest balancing was supreme. Those with a taste for irony will relish the fact that by the time the American Revolution had worked itself out to this conclusion, the British system, the corruption of which in the 18th century had set the revolution in motion, had somehow reformed itself and was now operating on the principles that most of the founding fathers unqualifiedly admired and meant to copy. As I said at the outset, this is not a 4th of July oration, but I do not wish to leave the impression that I consider the revolution to have been a mistake. Even if I were sure that a strong central government operating with consent and under law would produce effects that are on the whole preferable to those produced by a system of interest balancing, even then I would not think that the revolution was a mistake. For there is no doubt that without the American example, other nations, including the British and the Canadian, would not have succeeded as well, perhaps not at all, with their brand of democracy. But the more important thing is that a people could, by a deliberative process, accomplish what has always been regarded as the highest and noblest of all tasks: the creation of a political order that assures to the makers and their posterity the blessings of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That this could have been done has had, not only for us, but for the whole world, a significance that no other event could possibly have had. But if there is great reason for pride in the achievement, there is also reason for apprehension. Certainly for pondering such questions as those asked by Thomas Lowe Nichols in the book from which I've quoted several times. Nichols wrote, "If the only source of power is the will of the people, expressed by the votes of a majority, what are the institutions that may not be overthrown? What are the institutions that may not be established? The whole people own the whole property. What shall hinder them from doing with it as they will? So the people are above their institutions and may frame, modify, or abolish them according to their sovereign will and pleasure. Right is a matter of opinion and to be determined by a majority. Justice is what the majority chooses. Apparently, expediency is the only rule of conduct. Clearly, Thomas Lowe Nichols thought justice is not what the majority chooses, and that expediency is not the only rule. And so I must say, do I. Thank you.
We have just heard Dr. Edward C. Banfield discussing cities and the revolutionary tradition. Dr. Banfield said that the lack of a strong centralized government in the United States led to the development of cities in America quite distinctive from those in other countries. This lecture has been just one in a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, representing several differing points of view on the American Revolution and its meaning for us today. If you would like a copy of Dr. Banfield's lecture or of the entire series, write the American Enterprise Institute, that's AEI, Post Office Box 19191, Washington, D.C. 236. Until next time, this is Vermont Royster. Thank you for joining us.